Hi, welcome to this week's edition of PHQ, questions from the personality hacker community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And Addison, let's get right to our question today.
This is a comment from Reddit. Would NI, or perspectives, manifest itself differently in the thought processes of an INFJ differently than an INTJ? If so, could you talk about how it might? I have a best friend who is an INFJ, and while I consider myself to be a creative person, my ideas seem to be more concrete with a focus on realism in the external world, while his are more obviously abstract and difficult to apply to reality.
Thanks for the question. I think, so basically I'm going to summarize this question to say that driver of NI, which is short for the technical name of Introverted Intuition, we've nicknamed that process perspectives. The two types that drive with perspectives in their car, if you're looking at the car model we've developed here at Personality Hacker, are INTJs and INFJs. They're using their perspectives, that perspectives process, as the driver. That's how they show up to the world primarily. And they supplement that with that co-pilot position. INTJs would supplement it with extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed that effectiveness. INFJs would supplement that with extroverted feeling. We've nicknamed that harmony. So the question is, how does effectiveness influence perspectives for INTJs differently than harmony influencing perspectives for INFJs? And we basically would agree that there is incredible amount of influence from both of these co-pilots, but you've got to remember too, both of your 10-year-old processes are also going to be different. For an INTJ, their 10-year-old process in their car is going to be authenticity that will also influence that perspectives process. And for an INFJ, their 10-year-old process will be something we've nicknamed accuracy, and that's also going to influence that perspectives process. So there's several different influencers here, and they in fact do have a great impact on how that perspectives process shows up to the world.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and you're a Myers-Briggs geek, that 10-year-old process is the word that we use for the tertiary process. So I think there's a massive amount of influence that happens for that dominant process, depending upon what your auxiliary is. I mean, I've known so many INTJs that have tested out as sensors because their extroverted thinking process or effectiveness process is so concrete, right? Like, what is the criteria they're using to determine something's value? And that is, does it work, right? It's all about, we use the word effectiveness, but a lot of people who use this process like the word efficiency as well, because it's a cost-benefit analysis on everything. What is worth my time? What is worth my attention? How do I optimize that? How do I see it actually impacting the outer world? And you basically folded that piece into your question as well. When you're learning and when you're determining what kind of what kind of patterns are you looking at? What are your thoughts, experiments going to be? There's always going to be a practical tinge to it, like a distinctively practical note. Whereas for an INFJ, and I'm not going to say that they're not practical, they're definitely practical people. That said, when their driver process or that dominant process is being influenced, it's more going to be about what is connective, what is relationship oriented, how are people feeling, what gets everybody's needs met, which is a lot more. I mean, yes, you could write down a list of what are the unspoken social contracts of any particular culture, but it's still going to be a little bit more ethereal, right? There's not going to be as rigid or strong pass-fail criteria that harmony users are using, because the pass-fail criteria is how somebody is subjectively feeling about the situation. Right? Like, if you're going to be looking for win-wins, you got to kind of check in with somebody's like emotional state to go, is this a win for you? Right? Like, that's not nearly as specific, concrete, and tangible as effectiveness, checking in to determine whether or not it's passing on a pass-fail criteria with like specific metrics around it and numbers and data, etc.
Can I drive this car across this bridge and it not collapse, for example?
Yeah, which is a lot more than, can I drive across this bridge with the person in the car with me and they're going to feel good about our conversation as we're driving across the bridge, right? Like, it just by nature requires a different level of abstraction. So yeah, I do think that INFJs are going to be a lot more comfortable with abstractions than INTJs are in general, because when they're determining the quality or the importance of a conversation or a tool or an idea or whatever it is, an INFJ is going to be looking at its emotional or social impact, whereas an INTJ is going to be looking at its concrete, practical, does it work in the outside world component. So yeah, I would definitely say that INTJs have a tendency to be a little bit more concrete than INFJs. And you see this play out. INFJs are more attracted to things that other people might disregard as a bit woo-woo or a little they don't have to have such rigid concerns necessarily that it play out in the outer world before they adopt it as a tool for their life. I've seen that happen over and over. INTJs have a tendency to be more skeptical than INFJs are, for sure. But like you mentioned, the other piece that comes into it and influences it is what's in that tertiary position, or like you mentioned, the 10-year-old position. For an INFJ, it's introverted thinking, or what we call accuracy. For an INTJ, it's introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity. And so that's also going to influence that driver process because it's another introverted process. And when you're staying inside of yourself as an INJ, that's going to be a lot of the world that you're exploring. So for an INFJ, of course, it will be influenced by always being intrigued and interested in the social component. So when you're going to that introverted thinking place, right, that accuracy place, it's probably going to be accuracy as it's influenced by the social component. So it might turn more critical. It might turn more like, well, a person isn't supposed to be doing that thing, or it might turn more harsh. And by the same token, it might be a way for an INFJ to find solace in a less emotionally connective space, and it might turn more tech oriented, and it might turn more into like being really fascinated by technology. So they're going to apply their perspectives or introverted intuition process, having it be influenced by introverted thinking, which is very data oriented, but remember, it's still subjective. Introverted thinking is subjective analysis and evaluative criteria. So we're still staying in a position for an INFJ of a more subjective, less concrete experience for them. And that's also going to influence how that perspectives process shows up. Whereas an INTJ, when they go to their 10-year-old or the tertiary position, it's going to be equally subjective, but it's going to be about how they feel about something and what's striking their emotional chord. And it will always be at least colored by effectiveness, which is what is working in the outside world, and how do I know that's a pass-fail. So again, even when an INTJ goes to a subjective space, fundamentally what they're trying to do is make sure that something is working in the outside world. So even if they're checking with how they feel, it's going to be something that is colored by how the world is telling them that things should be working. And that's why I think so many INTJs go to emotions like, when they go to their 10-year-old process, like pride, or an emotion that is maybe indignation, because we get all sorts of messages from the outside world that there's a whole string of emotions that it is not okay that we evoke, right, or emote to other people. So even when they go to an emotional space, they're going to default to what society has told them is an acceptable emotion that will work in their interactions with other people. So they default to emotions like pride, etc. So yeah, I definitely think that your driver process is going to be massively influenced by both that co-pilot position and that 10-year-old position, and it's going to change the construction of everything, which is why an INJ is not an INJ is not an INJ, right? I mean, even all INFJs are not the same, and all INTJs are not the same. So obviously, even when you're looking at just the specific types themselves, there's going to be lots of different styles of archetypes even within that one type. But there's definitely huge differences between INTJs and INFJs. And I think that's a great question. And it's just a matter of observing some of these patterns and how they play out as, in you as individuals.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about you and I. No, we're not INJs, we're ENPs. You're an ENTP, I'm an ENFP. So we lead with extroverted intuition is the technical name. We've nicknamed it exploration. Both of us do. But yours is influenced the co-pilot of introverted thinking, or accuracy as we've nicknamed it. Mine's influenced by introverted feeling, or what we've nicknamed authenticity. And, both of us in a conversation, we come into a challenge in our relationship, for example, and, you instantly go into problem-solving mode of finding out what's the solution to solve this problem. And I ultimately go into a holding space mode emotionally, and like, what's the etymology of the emotions you're feeling or we're feeling in this? And both of us come to it, and I think it complements us in relationship, and it's because have different influencers. So our exploration process, or that extroverted intuition process, is being used differently because of its supplemental tools, our Copilot. You're using it to problem solve about a tangible problem or the data set of the problem, and I'm using it to explore the emotions of the situation and hold space for all the different emotions that are playing out and really mining those deep. And so we're using our intuition, the same process of intuition, we're using it differently based on another modifier in our cognitive function stack. So I think that's important to remember for all types, all the processes that show up. When you've got something that's your dominant process, it's always going to be influenced by the other processes around it. And I think that's why there's such very difference between types that seem so similar when you're talking about the dichotomy level of those 4 letters. But when you get down into the cognitive function stack, you realize just how different these types show up, even if they look similar on the surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think? Questions, comments, leave your feedback below this PHQ over at personalityhacker.com. And if you've got a question for us here at PHQ, this show where we answer questions from the community, you can ask that question over at personalityhacker.com/questions. You can either record your question, an audio version, we can edit it in directly, or you can write your question out and we can read it on the air and answer it that way. That's at personalityhacker.com/questions. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Thanks for joining us this week on PHQ Questions from the Personality Hacker community. We can't wait to talk with you on the next episode.